November 1927, Fifth Avenue, New York City. A wrecking crew rolled up to the corner of 57th Street with a single purpose: to erase the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan. A palace, 130 rooms, an entire city block, dripping with marble, gold leaf, carved stone, and decades of old-world opulence. The home of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore who once controlled America's railroads. But that morning, one of America's greatest mansions wasn't being preserved. It wasn't being restored. It wasn't even being sold. It was being destroyed. Not because of fire, not because of structural failure, not even because of scandal. It came down because nobody could afford it anymore. Taxes were too high. Servants were too scarce. The world that created such extravagance had collapsed. The Gilded Age, the era of steel barons, railroad kings, oil monopolists, grand balls, and unimaginable inequality was dead, and its death wasn't sudden. It was slow, grinding, inevitable. The result of decades of pressure from labor revolts, investigative journalists, progressive reformers, world war, taxation, shifting values, and a society waking up to the dangerous consequences of concentrated power. This is the shocking truth behind how America's Gilded Age fell, not with a dramatic explosion, but with the quiet, steady erosion of a system built on extremes. And to understand why the mansions fell, why fortunes evaporated, and why an entire social order vanished, we must start where the destruction was most visible: at the wrecking ball. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed. We create deep dive documentaries just like this, exploring America's forgotten histories, untold power struggles, and the hidden forces that shape the world you live in today. If you love to hear this, hit subscribe and join the community. The Vanderbilt mansion stretched from 5th Avenue to Madison, from 57th to 58th. It stood as a monument to the peak of American wealth, a house meant not just to be lived in, but to intimidate, to dominate, to announce the success of a single family. Built in 1882 by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the house was the ultimate status symbol. Designed by architect George Brown Post, it cost the modern equivalent of more than $90 million. Inside, everything glowed: stained glass, carved oak, imported marble, ceilings dripping in gold, a ballroom for hundreds, a grand hall 3 stories tall. It was built during a time when fortunes grew too fast for the human mind to comprehend. But by the 1922nd, the house was already a relic. Alice Vanderbilt, widowed and aging, had clung to it for as long as she could. But maintaining a mansion wasn't just expensive, it was impossible. Property taxes, $30,000 a year. Heating and maintenance, another $70,000. Servant wages, at least $100,000 more. To live here, you didn't just need wealth, you needed an empire. And the Vanderbilts no longer had one. The younger generation didn't want the burden. They preferred modern apartments, weekend estates, streamlined living. The world had changed, but the mansion hadn't. Bergdorf Goodman purchased the land. Not the house, the land. The house itself was worthless. And so, in 1927, the workers climbed onto the slate roof and began prying away the tiles, the first pieces of a Titan coming down. Newspapers documented every blow of the hammer. New Yorkers gathered on the sidewalks, not to celebrate, but to witness the symbolic end of an era. By the end, nothing remained. Not the staircase, not the ceilings, not the rooms where America's elites once danced and schemed. Just an empty lot, ready for a commercial building. Commerce over aristocracy, efficiency over excess, public access replacing private privilege. The Gilded Age was over. But to understand its fall, we need to understand its rise. The Civil War ended in 1865, leaving the United States battered, divided, but filled with possibility. What followed was something extraordinary, a transformation so rapid that no society in history had ever experienced anything like it. Railroads unified the country. Steel built its bones. Oil lit its nights. And behind every breakthrough stood a single man, ruthless, brilliant, relentless, who turned opportunity into empire. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, understood transportation better than anyone alive. He consolidated rail systems, connected cities, slashed inefficiencies, and built lines that moved America at unprecedented speed. His fortune soared to over $100 million, the largest in American history to that point. But he wasn't alone. Carnegie built steel empires that fed the railroads. Rockefeller carved a monopoly from crude oil and turned kerosene into gold. Morgan financed it all, controlling industries from behind velvet banking doors. The result? A society where 1% owned more wealth than the bottom, 90% combined. Workers labored 12-hour days in deadly conditions. Children toiled in factories. No income tax existed. No regulations protected labor. Monopolies crushed competition. Corruption ran through every level of government. It was a world where fortunes were so vast and rapid that millionaires felt like gods, untouchable, unstoppable. But this wealth came with a problem no amount of money could solve: cultural legitimacy. And one woman stood between the new rich and the society they desperately wanted to join. Money was not enough to enter high society, not in New York, not in the 1,870 seconds. Not when Caroline Schermerhorn Astor held the keys to the kingdom. She decided who mattered. She decided who belonged. And she decided that new money like the Vanderbilts did not. Her infamous 400, the supposed capacity of her ballroom, became the number of people who counted in New York. Everyone else? Irrelevant. The Vanderbilts fought for years to gain entry. They built mansions. They hosted parties. They flaunted their wealth. But Mrs. Astor ignored them. That is, until Alva Vanderbilt forced her hand by throwing the most extravagant ball New York had ever seen, a $1 million spectacle that the press couldn't stop talking about. Mrs. Astor finally visited. Social acceptance was granted, and suddenly, every millionaire on Fifth Avenue raced to outdo the other. This competition reshaped Manhattan itself. Between 1880 and 1905, Fifth Avenue transformed from quiet lots to the most expensive residential street in the nation. French chateaux, Italian palaces, Beaux-Arts fantasies, marble imported from Europe, ceilings painted by hand, rooms built to impress, not to function. Mansions became statements, and the wealthy raced to build bigger, faster, grander, but behind every glittering hall was an army of invisible labor. The mansions dazzled the eye, but their magic depended on hundreds of unseen hands moving in silence beneath the surface. Every polished banister, every gleaming chandelier, every immaculate ballroom floor was the product of bodies that rose before dawn and collapsed long after midnight. The Gilded Age elite lived in a world where perfection was expected, but perfection required labor on a scale most Americans couldn't imagine. Before sunrise, maids carried buckets of hot water up endless staircases. Fires needed to be lit in every hearth, drapes shaken out, silver polished, rugs beaten, floors scrubbed on hands and knees. The family themselves never heard the clatter of pans or the hiss of coal in the furnace. The mechanics of life were hidden behind doors they never opened. For the wealthy, comfort was a right. For servants, comfort was a myth. A butler oversaw the male staff footmen in immaculate livery chosen for height and looks, valets who dressed the master, coachmen, grooms, pantry boys. A housekeeper ran the female staff, directing parlor maids, chambermaids, laundresses, and the overworked scullery maids, who spent their days elbow-deep in boiling water and soap. A great house functioned like a military operation. Strict hierarchy, precise timing, and no room for error. A spilled glass of wine, a late appearance with a coat, a footman coughing during a formal dinner, any of it could mean dismissal. Domestic service was relentless. 16-hour days, one afternoon off per month, wages barely enough to live on. Most servants were young immigrants fleeing poverty in Ireland, Italy, Germany, or Scandinavia. They traded freedom for stability, but the cost was steep. They lived in cramped attic rooms, ate leftovers the family didn't want, and endured indignities quietly because silence kept them employed. Some households were kind, many were cruel. Girls were dismissed for gaining weight, for blushing at the wrong man, for receiving a letter from home. If a servant became pregnant, whether by consent or assault, she was usually thrown out without references, condemned to destitution. Households enforced strict rules: no followers, no courting, no personal visitors. Servants existed to serve, nothing more. Their lives made the lavish world above stairs possible, yet they were treated as shadows. But change was coming for them too. When factories began hiring women, and when department stores offered wages plus independence, domestic service stopped being the default option for immigrant girls. Freedom became more attractive than prestige. A future away from servitude became possible. And slowly, the labor force that powered the Gilded Age began to vanish. Families clinging to 50-room mansions found themselves unable to staff them, a quiet economic unraveling that the wealthy were too insulated to see until it was too late. While servants fought private battles, America's millionaires launched a different kind of war, a cultural campaign to prove they belonged among the world's nobility. They didn't just want money, they wanted legitimacy, respect, prestige. They wanted to be seen as the heirs of Europe's aristocracy, not upstart businessmen from a country barely 100 years old. And so, they bought Europe one masterpiece at a time. Old British families, suffering from falling agricultural income, began selling treasures that had hung in manors for centuries. Italian palaces reduced their collections. French chateaux parted with tapestries and furniture. Where European nobles saw financial necessity, American millionaires saw opportunity. They tore Renaissance ceilings from villas and reinstalled them in New York drawing rooms. They bought Rembrandts, Vermeers, and Velázquez, with the ease of men buying neckties. Dealers like Joseph Duveen encouraged the frenzy, convincing buyers that culture itself could be purchased if only they spent enough. Some collectors cared deeply about art, most cared about status. Owning an old master painting wasn't just aesthetic, it was a signal, a code, a message that said, "My wealth is not new, I am refined. I am sophisticated, I belong." This art race became intense, competitive, and absurdly expensive. Morgan amassed libraries and artifacts so quickly he barely saw most of what he purchased. Frick built an entire house just to display his growing portrait collection. The Vanderbilts filled rooms with French paneling, Chinese porcelain, Italian marble, all symbols of a cultivated identity they desperately wanted the world to acknowledge. But there was a flaw in this plan. You can buy paintings, but you can't buy history. And critics, both in Europe and America, mocked the nouveau riche for trying. They saw the truth. Wealth without roots is fragile. The millionaires wanted aristocracy, but they were still industrialists, men whose fortunes came from steel mills, coal mines, and backbreaking labor. The art collections outlasted them, but the illusion of legitimacy did not. If servants sustained the mansions and art filled their walls, the newspapers shattered their foundations. Investigative journalists, muckrakers, as Roosevelt mockingly called them, tore apart the myth of benevolent American capitalism. Their articles exposed corruption, monopolies, poverty wages, bribery, child labor, political manipulation, and the brutal tactics used by the richest men to secure their power. Ida Tarbell dismantled Rockefeller's reputation piece by piece. Her work revealed secret railroad rebates, predatory pricing, intimidation, and the cold, calculating strategy behind Standard Oil's domination. Suddenly, Rockefeller was no longer a respected titan. He was a robber baron, a man who crushed competition rather than earned success. Upton Sinclair horrified the nation with descriptions of rotting meat, poisoned products, and workers maimed in Chicago's stockyards. David Graham Phillips exposed senators bought and paid for by industry. Ray Stannard Baker revealed racial injustice, labor exploitation, and deep inequalities the wealthy preferred to ignore. These stories struck the public like lightning. Americans saw their nation clearly for the first time not as a land of opportunity, but as a land of extremes. The rich had not succeeded through moral superiority. They had succeeded through leverage, power, and the suffering of countless workers. Public admiration turned to suspicion, then anger, then activism. Reformers demanded laws. Voters demanded accountability. Politicians sensed the shift and followed. The Gilded Age elite believed their fortunes made them untouchable. They didn't see that public opinion, the only true source of legitimacy in a democracy, was slipping away. And once the public withdrew its respect, the foundations of elite power began to crack. The strikes started soon after. At first, small, then everywhere. Railroad workers, steel workers, miners, textile laborers, hundreds of thousands walked off the job, refusing to endure the brutal conditions that built the fortunes of the 1%. When companies hired strikebreakers, workers fought. When the government sent troops, bloodshed followed. Protesters were killed, factories burned, trains derailed, cities erupted. The elite reacted with terror. For decades, they had assumed workers were silent, submissive, grateful for whatever wages they were given. But the strikes revealed a truth the wealthy had never acknowledged. Their power relied on the labor of people they barely considered human. Without workers, their businesses stopped. Without workers, their fortunes crumbled. Without workers, their society collapsed. By the time the income tax arrived in 1913, the tide had fully turned. For the first time in American history, the government could tax wealth directly. The wealthy were outraged. They argued the tax was unfair, immoral, dangerous. But the public supported it. After decades of inequality, Americans saw taxation as a way to rebalance the system. It was only the beginning. When war erupted in Europe, the world the Gilded Age elite had built began imploding at high speed. The war destroyed European aristocracy, robbed the wealthy of their cultural role models, empowered women, strengthened workers, expanded government authority, and legitimized taxation as a permanent necessity. The idea of giant private households filled with servants became absurd. Lavish balls seemed distasteful. Competing for status suddenly felt childish and disconnected from reality. The wealthy tried to continue as before, but the world had evolved around them. They could not maintain 100-room mansions with shrinking fortunes. They could not employ dozens of servants when factories offered better wages and freedom. They could not justify extreme luxury when society increasingly demanded fairness and efficiency. Their children, raised in a new century, rejected the old ways entirely. They preferred apartments, travel, education, careers, and smaller homes that reflected modern values. They saw the mansions as burdens, symbols of a world that no longer existed. And slowly, inevitably, the palaces began to fall. They fell first in whispers. A leaky roof here, a furnace too old to repair, a dining room closed off to save heating costs, servants dismissed without replacement. Once grand homes shrinking room by room, floor by floor, until only a handful of spaces remained truly livable. Families wandered through echoing halls like ghosts in their own homes, clutching the remnants of a life that no longer fit the century they were living in. But soon, whispers grew into confessions. Heirs stared at bookkeeping ledgers and realized the numbers were impossible. They were inheriting palaces with operating costs that exceeded their incomes. The taxes alone devoured fortunes. Staff demanded higher wages. Maintenance costs climbed into the tens of thousands per year, and the world increasingly viewed such extravagance with open resentment. In private, descendants admitted what their grandparents never could. We can't afford this life. So they sold. Not because they were poor, but because the economics of the Gilded Age no longer existed. A mansion built for a world without taxes, without labor rights, without modern utilities, without economic regulation, simply could not survive in a society that had evolved beyond all of that. Buyers weren't interested in the houses. They wanted the land. Fifth Avenue had transformed from a residential showplace into one of the most valuable commercial districts on Earth. Department stores, luxury retailers, office towers, and high-rise apartments generated far more revenue than any single family ever could. Land developers saw gold where the old elite saw memories. And when land is worth millions, nostalgia doesn't stand a chance. So the wreckers arrived. They pulled apart carved limestone blocks from facades that artisans had spent years shaping. They toppled marble columns that had been imported across an ocean. They destroyed ballrooms where America's social hierarchy had once been decided. Some mantels, staircases, and doors were salvaged, sold quietly to collectors or architects who hoped to preserve tiny fragments of the past. Most was tossed into rubble piles and carted to landfills. Buildings that symbolized the pinnacle of American luxury structures, meant to rival the chateau of Europe, vanished in clouds of dust and debris. It took decades to build them. It took weeks to erase them. The public responded with mixed emotions. Older generations mourned the loss, remembering a time when Fifth Avenue strolls meant admiring palaces rather than storefronts. Younger generations shrugged. To them, the mansions symbolized inequality, not beauty. Critics argued their destruction was necessary, even moral. Progressives insisted the age of aristocratic display had to end for America to move forward. But a few voices asked difficult questions. Were these homes, despite their excesses, masterpieces worth protecting? Couldn't they have become museums, libraries, or public institutions? The answer came too late. By the time preservationists rallied, nearly all of the great houses were already gone. Entire architectural movements disappeared with them. Craftsmen capable of creating such buildings dwindled. No one built mansions with hand-carved stone and imported marble anymore. The economics didn't allow it. The culture didn't desire it. New York reinvented itself, as it always does. Art Deco towers rose where palaces once stood. The city embraced modernism, efficiency, and commercial ambition. The new buildings were elegant but practical, impressive but profitable. They didn't pretend to be aristocratic estates. They didn't hide their purpose. They were for business, for commerce, for the thousands, not the privileged few. Still, a handful of Gilded Age survivors remained, not because families held on to them, but because they evolved. The wealthy discovered that public institutions, unlike heirs, could afford to maintain grand buildings indefinitely. Endowments replaced inheritance. Public interest replaced private pride. When Henry Clay Frick's mansion became the Frick Collection, his art found new purpose. His galleries, once reserved for a select circle, opened to anyone who paid the modest admission fee. Visitors walked the same hallways he once paced, admired the same Rembrandts he purchased, listened to the same floorboards creak under their weight. The house lived on because it belonged to everyone now. The Morgan Library did the same. J.P. Morgan's vast trove of manuscripts and rare books transformed into an architectural jewel accessible to scholars and tourists alike. His private reading room, once seen only by the elite, became a sanctuary of knowledge for the world. Newport fared slightly better than New York. The summer cottages survived because they weren't weighed down by year-round expenses. Eventually, preservation societies stepped in, recognizing that these homes, however extravagant, held cultural value. Today, visitors walk through Marble House, the Breakers, and Rosecliff, marveling at an era that vanished almost overnight. But for every house saved, dozens were lost. The physical evidence of the Gilded Age all but disappeared. What remains are scattered remnants. A staircase here, a fireplace there, an archway embedded into a modern building. The city that once displayed wealth with shameless grandeur now hides most of that history under layers of reinvention. And yet, the disappearance of the mansions tells a deeper story, one that extends beyond architecture, beyond economics, beyond nostalgia. The fall of the Gilded Age was not just the fall of houses. It was the fall of a belief system, the belief that wealth could exist without responsibility, that privilege could survive without adaptation, that grandeur could endure while inequality deepened. The world changed, values changed, people changed, and the structures built on outdated assumptions crumbled, both literally and metaphorically. The war reshaped everything. When American soldiers crossed the Atlantic in 1917, they encountered a world unraveling. They watched European aristocracy die on the fields of France. Young men with titles that stretched back centuries fell in trenches infested with rats. They saw nobility stripped of mystique, reduced to terrified boys facing artillery and gas attacks. When those American soldiers returned home, they brought with them a new worldview. They no longer envied Europe's aristocracy, they pitied it. They questioned why a small class should own so much while so many had so little. They questioned why wealthy families lived in palaces while veterans struggled to find work. They questioned why old rules mattered at all. Women, too, emerged transformed. After taking on factory and industrial roles during the war, they experienced independence unlike anything their mothers had known. They earned their own wages. They controlled their own time. And they refused to return quietly to the domestic roles society expected. Mansions that required armies of maids suddenly had no one willing to fill those roles anymore. Workers demanded better conditions. Labor unions grew stronger. Politicians passed reforms. The government expanded its reach. The wealthy found themselves navigating a society that no longer believed they were inherently superior. They clung to their mansions for as long as they could, but the world was not interested in enabling their illusions. Everything that sustained the Gilded Age was eroding at once: labor, wealth, legitimacy, cultural identity, and the unquestioned belief that the elite stood above ordinary people. The result was inevitable. The system collapsed under its own weight. And as the system collapsed, the buildings that symbolized it followed. The collapse did not come loudly. It didn't come with riots on Fifth Avenue or mobs demanding entry into marble-lined halls. It came quietly, subtly, through the slow tightening of financial realities that even the wealthiest families could no longer ignore. For generations, they had believed their fortunes were permanent. They thought their homes were monuments that would stand as long as their names. But permanence was an illusion. Even steel barons and railroad kings could not outmaneuver time. The income tax was the first blow. It changed everything. When the government took a substantial portion of annual earnings, suddenly money didn't stretch the way it once had. What had once been a comfortable surplus became a thin margin. Extravagance became a burden. Running a mansion required liquid, wealth, constant, flowing, enormous, and that flow had slowed. Then came the inheritance tax. The vast fortunes that once passed effortlessly from parent to child were now diminished at each transfer. The wealth that built the mansions was not the wealth inherited by their grandchildren. Each generation received less and faced higher costs. The mathematics no longer worked. Old money was running out. Even families who were still wealthy by ordinary standards were wealthy in the wrong way. They were asset-rich, income-poor. Their value was trapped in land and houses that cost more to maintain than they produced. A mansion is not a liquid asset. It doesn't generate revenue. It consumes it. And more devastating than taxes or falling fortunes was something the Gilded Age elite had never anticipated: the total transformation of cultural values. America was no longer impressed by excess. A new generation saw grandeur as wasteful, not admirable. A new definition of success emerged, one rooted in innovation, efficiency, influence, and public engagement, not marble staircases and gilded ceilings. Young heirs did not want to live in cavernous homes staffed like small hotels. They wanted freedom, mobility, privacy. They wanted apartments with elevators instead of mansions with coal-powered boilers. They wanted lives unencumbered by the rigid rituals of society their grandparents had upheld. To them, the old world was not glamorous. It was heavy, suffocating, outdated. And so the mansions, already strained by finances, now faced abandonment from within. The final blow came from the world outside their doors, the relentless rise of modern urban economics. Fifth Avenue land values skyrocketed. A single block could generate unimaginable profits if developed into apartments or commercial buildings. The presence of one family in a mansion became not just impractical, but irrational. Developers offered millions, far more than any heir could refuse. They saw what the elite could not: that the future of New York City was upward, dense, commercial, modern. The age of private palaces was over, not because people hated them, but because the city had outgrown them. Bergdorf Goodman's rise on the Vanderbilt site was not an isolated event. It was a symbol of a broader transformation. Fifth Avenue became a corridor of commerce. Luxury became democratized. Anyone with money could walk through doors once guarded by butlers with lists of approved names. The exclusivity that defined the Gilded Age dissolved into a new economic model: consume, don't curate; shop, don't socialize; buy, don't be invited. A single department store could serve thousands. A single mansion served one family. The choice was obvious. The physical destruction of the mansions mirrored a deeper societal demolition. Gone was the idea that wealth should remain unseen behind closed doors. Gone was the belief that a small group should dominate social life. Gone was the unquestioned hierarchy that placed a few families at the top of American society simply because they were born into money. Modern America rejected that system, not through revolution, but through evolution, through laws, taxes, cultural shifts, changing labor markets, and new ideals. Wealth had to earn its place now. It had to contribute, innovate, adapt. The Gilded Age elite never adapted. They mistook their peak for permanence. And yet, not everything from the era vanished. Some pieces survived, transformed, repurposed, reclaimed by the public. The art collections the wealthy once used to imitate European nobility became the foundation of world-class museums. The masterpieces Frick, Morgan, and others spent fortunes acquiring now belong to everyone. Their personal desire for legitimacy, ironically, created enduring cultural institutions. The few remaining mansions that avoided the wrecking ball did so by opening their doors to the world. As museums, libraries, and clubs, they became valuable in ways their builders never imagined. Carnegie's mansion serves education. The Frick collection preserves beauty. The Morgan Library protects knowledge. Their survival depended not on wealth, but on purpose. The demolished homes, however, remain only in photographs, silent, grainy reminders that even the grandest eras can disappear. In the end, the fall of the Gilded Age was not a tragedy. It was a transition, a necessary shedding of a system built on unsustainable foundations. A correction of a society stretched too thin at the top and too strained at the bottom. The wrecking balls did not destroy America's greatness, they revealed it. They symbolized a nation no longer willing to devote entire city blocks to the comfort of a single family. A nation embracing mobility over inheritance, modernity over nostalgia, equity over excess. But the most enduring lesson of all: nothing lasts, not even wealth that once seemed infinite. Not even families who believed history bent around their names. Not even mansions built to outlive their owners. The Gilded Age was magnificent, excessive, flawed, grand, fragile, and in the end, it collapsed for the simplest reason. It could not change. What remained after the fall was not rubble, not loss, but revelation. When the dust settled, America confronted a truth it had avoided for decades, that the Gilded Age, for all its brilliance, had been built on foundations too narrow to support its own weight. It glowed, yes, but it burned too hot, too fast, consuming resources, people, labor, and legitimacy, until nothing remained but the outlines of a system that had once dazzled the world. Yet the story does not end with collapse. It ends with transformation. The wrecking balls that crashed through carved staircases and gilded ceilings were not symbols of destruction, they were symbols of renewal. They cleared the way for a different America, one that embraced modernity rather than monarchy, innovation rather than imitation. A country that no longer tried to copy European aristocracy, but sought to define its own identity. And the identity that emerged was unmistakably American. Walk down Fifth Avenue today, and you won't see marble palaces guarded by footmen in livery. You'll see skyscrapers catching the sunlight in glass and steel. You'll see storefronts open to anyone with a wallet. You'll see hotels, offices, apartments, spaces designed for movement, not stasis, for commerce, not exclusivity. These buildings reflect the values of the century that followed the Gilded Age: efficiency, accessibility, vertical ambition. They stretch upward because America learned not to build sideways around a few families, but upward for millions. And yet, if you know where to look, you can still find the ghosts. The curve of a staircase salvaged from a lost mansion, now installed in a private home, a marble fireplace rescued from demolition, sitting in the lobby of a hotel, a wrought iron gate that once guarded the entrance to a palace, repurposed for a museum garden. The past tucks itself into corners of the present, whispering reminders of what once was. But the clearest echoes live in the institutions that survived, precisely because they shed the selfishness that doomed the mansions. Step into the Frick collection, and you walk through rooms preserved almost exactly as Henry Clay Frick designed them. Paintings illuminated in quiet galleries, soft light falling across velvets and woodwork. A house once meant to display private power now offers public beauty. It endures not because it was grand, but because it was given away. The Morgan Library feels like entering the mind of a titan. Manuscripts aligned in perfect symmetry, rare books glowing under warm lamps. But the building breathes because it belongs to scholars, students, tourists, in short, to the world. These places survived because they transformed, they adapted, they found purpose beyond the families who built them. The mansions that refused to adapt, that clung to their exclusivity, fell. That is the story of the Gilded Age, its rise fueled by ambition, its reign defined by spectacle, and its fall driven not by villainy or revolution, but by the unavoidable gravity of change. Because societies evolve, economies modernize, values shift, and any structure, literal or metaphorical, that fails to shift with them becomes obsolete. The Gilded Age elite believe themselves immune to time, but time is undefeated. It erodes wealth. It rewrites norms. It demands relevance. And no amount of marble or gold can protect anyone from its reach. What endures today is not the Gilded Age itself, but the lessons it left behind. Lessons about inequality, ambition, excess, innovation, and the responsibility that comes with power. We are still living with the consequences of those lessons. The skyscrapers, the corporations, the museums, the tax codes, the labor rights, the urban planning decisions, all trace invisible lines back to the moment the Gilded Age rose, glittered, fractured, and fell. And if there is a final truth beneath the rubble of America's lost palaces, it is this: wealth that serves only itself will always vanish. Wealth that serves others can endure forever. The families who built the Gilded Age left behind almost no homes, but they left behind libraries, museums, parks, and institutions that enrich lives long after their names have faded. Their mansions turn to dust, but their legacies, reshaped by public purpose, remain. In the end, the fall of America's Gilded Age was not just the end of a wealthy era, it was the beginning of a new American identity, one that values progress over privilege, reinvention over inheritance, collective benefit over private grandeur. The great palaces have disappeared, but what they taught us defines the nation that rose in their place. And perhaps that is the shocking truth. The Gilded Age had to fall, so America could rise. The fall of the Gilded Age wasn't a sudden collapse but a slow unraveling, a steady recognition that the world no longer revolved around the people who believed they were its center. Yet even as the mansions disappeared and fortunes thinned, something profound lingered in the air, an unspoken question about what America had gained and what it had lost in the process. For decades, the wealthy had shaped the nation's identity through architecture, philanthropy, and the sheer force of their ambition. They believed they were building a legacy that would define America forever. Instead, their creations became relics of a past that the future could no longer sustain. But as ordinary citizens walked the new, modern Fifth Avenue past department stores, office towers, and bustling sidewalks, they encountered something that had never existed before. An America no longer built for the privilege of the few. And that democratization came with its own story. One that unfolded in the streets, factories, shops, and homes of millions whose lives had been overshadowed by the glitter of the elite. Their struggles, their collective actions, and their refusal to accept the conditions imposed upon them shaped the nation's trajectory just as powerfully as any railroad tycoon or steel magnate. In the early decades of the 20th century, ordinary workers stepped into a spotlight they had never been allowed to occupy. They marched, protested, organized, risked their jobs, their safety, and in many cases, their lives. They demanded the 8-hour workday, fair wages, safe conditions, rights that seem obvious now but were radical at the time. Their resistance chipped away at the foundations of the old order more effectively than any wrecking ball. Employees who once lived in fear of dismissal suddenly recognized their own value. The rise of labor unions meant that factory workers, dock hands, miners, and railroad employees were no longer isolated individuals. They were a collective force. Their strikes were not merely disruptions. They were declarations that the era of unchecked exploitation was ending. And, as labor gained strength, the wealthy realized something they had never feared before. They were outnumbered. A nation cannot function when its workers refuse to work. A mansion cannot operate when its servants disappear. A business cannot thrive when its employees walk out. Power was no longer determined solely by wealth. It was determined by the willingness of the public to accept or reject the structures that wealth had built. Slowly, the balance shifted. The press, once controlled by the elite, now carried stories that amplified the voices of those at the bottom. Reports of dangerous workplaces, starving families, corrupt politicians, and corporate abuses turned public opinion sharply against the gilded class. Where journalists once praised lavish balls and soirees, they now condemned them as grotesque performances staged beside the suffering of millions. And this shift in sentiment became the invisible engine of change. Reformers entered politics with new visions of what America could be. Figures like Theodore Roosevelt challenged monopolies, split trusts, and enforced regulations that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Progressive lawmakers fought for child labor laws, food safety standards, and consumer protections. Courts, once loyal to industrialists, began ruling in favor of workers and citizens. The elite resisted, but resistance only delayed what was inevitable. Every force, economic, political, cultural, was pushing the nation away from its gilded roots. Meanwhile, a different kind of shift was happening inside the households of the wealthy. Servant culture, once the backbone of upper-class life, was fracturing. Young women who might once have worked as maids or laundresses now found better-paying jobs with shorter hours and more autonomy. For the first time, they could rent rooms of their own, wear clothing that wasn't a uniform, make choices without the judgment of an employer. They no longer needed the wealthy, and the wealthy, for all their money, couldn't replace them. Without servants, the great mansions became impossible to maintain. Dust accumulated, plumbing malfunctioned, rooftops leaked. Families shut down entire sections of their homes, living in a handful of rooms while the rest decayed. They hosted fewer events. They dismissed staff. They pretended everything was fine, even as they walked through hallways their ancestors would never have believed could sit cold and dark. It was as if the houses themselves understood they were fading. By the 1,920 seconds, the nation had undergone a psychological transformation. Americans no longer revered aristocratic behavior, they mocked it. The spectacle of excess seemed childish compared to the sacrifices many had made during the war. The idea of grand balls and diamond-studded gowns felt disconnected from the realities of modern life. The public demanded simplicity, modesty, practicality. The wealthy tried to adapt, but adaptation required a humility they had never cultivated. Their children, the heirs, were far more willing to let go. They embraced new technologies, new styles, new forms of entertainment. They drove cars instead of arriving by carriage. They went to jazz clubs instead of formal receptions. They traveled lightly, lived lightly, spent lightly. They were done with inherited burdens. And so, one by one, families signed away their properties. Lawyers facilitated transactions that were unthinkable in the Gilded Days. Estates were liquidated, furnishings auctioned, art sold, land transferred, papers signed with hands that trembled not from sadness alone but from disbelief. The world they had been raised to preserve was dissolving beneath them. But in this dissolution was a surprising truth liberation. Many heirs felt relief as they closed the doors of homes they never wanted. They saw the world as it was becoming fast, modern, fluid, democratic, alive, and they chose to step into it. Leaving behind the marble staircases and gilded mirrors wasn't a tragedy for them. It was an escape. It was the older generations who understood the magnitude of loss. They watched their family histories reduced to rubble, their legacies scattered through sales and demolitions. They mourned a world that had promised permanence but delivered impermanence instead. In the end, the fall of the Gilded Age was a quiet surrender. There was no singular moment, no dramatic explosion, no symbolic tipping point, just a gradual recognition that the era had outlived itself and that holding on would change nothing. A new century demanded new systems, new values, new structures. Still, if you walk through the museums, through the surviving houses, through the fragments preserved in display cases, you can feel the weight of what once was. You can almost hear the echo of ballroom orchestras, the clink of crystal, the murmur of wealthy voices, discussing politics and marriage prospects and stock prices. You can feel the texture of a world that dazzled itself into believing it would last forever. But the truth is timeless. No structure survives when built only for the few. No fortune endures untouched by change. No era, no matter how gilded, is permanent. The Gilded Age rose because ambition demanded it. It fell because reality required it. And what emerged in its place was a country ready to define itself on new terms. Less glittering, perhaps, but more grounded, more just, more true to its people. And that is the real legacy of the fall. Not the loss of palaces, but the rise of a nation no longer built around them. The fall of America's Gilded Age didn't just reshape the skyline or empty the great houses, it reshaped the very idea of what America believed it should be. As the old order faded, a new identity began forming in its place, one built not on inherited grandeur but on adaptability, mobility, and the belief that progress belonged to everyone, not merely a chosen few. But while society moved forward, something else was happening beneath the surface, something quieter, something easily overlooked. As mansions crumbled and fortunes thinned, the past slipped from memory, leaving behind shadows that only historians, architects, and a handful of preservationists knew how to see. Entire neighborhoods vanished not through catastrophe, but through neglect, redevelopment, and the passage of time. What had once been symbols of dominance became ghosts, embedded in the foundations of modern buildings. Yet even as these transformations took place, many Americans wondered what, exactly, had been lost. The Gilded Age had been flawed, unequal, exploitative, deeply unjust, but it had also been unapologetically ambitious. It built railroads across continents, industries that shaped the world, art collections that filled entire museums, and behind the excess and corruption lived an undeniable reality. Those who built the era believed, utterly, that they were forging the future. The tragedy was that they misunderstood what kind of future they were creating. By the early 20th century, America was changing in ways the original Titans could never have predicted. A middle class was rising, educated, organized, politically active. They didn't aspire to palaces. They wanted stability, opportunity, security. They wanted comfortable homes, not castles, steady income, not dynastic fortunes. This new American dream clashed directly with the Gilded Age ideal. And nowhere was this shift more visible than in the architecture. Walk through New York in the 1,920 seconds, and you would see the last era fading right before your eyes. The ornate facades of Fifth Avenue, once carved to resemble French chateaux and Italian palazzi, were increasingly dwarfed by steel-framed towers. The skyline grew upward, not outward. Buildings became metaphors, sleek, modern, efficient, celebrating a nation that valued speed and productivity over inherited privilege. Art Deco buildings emphasized machine-age beauty, geometry, symmetry, progress. They didn't whisper of lineage, they shouted of innovation. Their polished metal, their sharp angles, their stylized ornamentation all reflected a nation defining itself by what it was becoming, not by what it had been. This shift wasn't accidental. It was a direct response to cultural demands. The Gilded Age had insisted that wealth announce itself, that it be seen from afar, but modern America wanted something different, architecture that reflected possibility, not pedigree. The skyscraper became the new symbol of success not because it housed the wealthy, but because it housed everyone. Businesses, workers, executives, customers all occupied the same vertical structure. Where one family had once dominated a city block, now thousands of people move through the same building daily. It was efficiency replacing extravagance, productivity replacing privilege, public purpose replacing private spectacle. And yet, behind the modernization, a subtle grief lingered. Preservationists documented the demolitions with urgency, aware that history was slipping through their fingers. Newspapers published photographs of mansions mid-collapse, grand staircases exposed to the sky, ballrooms split in half, carved stone lions decapitated by wrecking crews. The images shocked viewers not because they loved the wealthy, but because they realized something deeper. Eras can vanish in silence if no one fights to remember them. The more Americans watched the old world disappear, the more they wondered what its disappearance meant. In a way, the destruction of the mansions symbolized a cleansing, a removal of a system that had been allowed to grow too powerful and too detached. But it also symbolized something else, a nation divorcing itself from a complicated heritage, one filled with both achievement and arrogance. And as America moved into the modern age, it did so with the uneasy understanding that progress always demands a sacrifice. Still, even as walls fell, memories remained. Stories passed down, artifacts preserved, museum wings dedicated to what once stood proudly on Fifth Avenue. These remnants revealed a strange contradiction. Although the era collapsed under the weight of its own excess, Americans were still fascinated by it. They still marveled at the opulence, questioned the motives, criticized the inequities, and studied the mistakes. The Gilded Age became a mirror, reflecting both aspiration and warning. But it also raised a question that would echo long after the last mansion came down. Was the Gilded Age truly an era that deserved to fall? Or was it a flawed foundation upon which the modern nation was built? The answer, like the era itself, was complicated. On one hand, its collapse represented justice. Workers gained rights, women gained power, immigrants found opportunity, democracy strengthened. The gap between rich and poor, while still immense, no longer defined the nation's identity as starkly as before. America seemed less like a playground for the wealthy, and more like a shared enterprise. On the other hand, the fall revealed an unsettling truth. Even the grandest systems can crumble when economic, social, and political pressures converge. The wealthy thought their world was permanent. They built for eternity. They planned for generations. But eternity never came. Their legacies were undone not by force but by time itself, by changes they failed to anticipate and refused to adapt to. In the end, the fall of the Gilded Age wasn't just architectural or economic, it was psychological. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. The belief that wealth could insulate a family forever, that society would always respect money, that grandeur equaled importance, all proved false. America had grown up, and as the nation entered the mid-20th century, it carried with it both the pride of its progress and the ghost of its past. The Gilded Age had been dazzling, corrupt, artistic, misguided, innovative, exploitative, magnificent, and deeply flawed. Its fall was necessary, but its story remained vital. Because eras don't vanish, they transform. And the remnants of the Gilded Age, its art, its institutions, its cautionary lessons continue to shape the country even now. Even as the mansions disappeared and a new America took shape, the legacy of the Gilded Age clung to the country in unexpected ways. Its influence seeped into laws, cities, business practices, and even into the cultural imagination. The past had not vanished. It had simply woven itself into the foundations of everyday life, often unnoticed, yet undeniably present. Industries born from the ambition of the Gilded Age continued shaping American identity. Railroads remained essential to commerce. Steel framed the new skyscrapers that rose across the nation. Oil companies, even after being broken into smaller entities, grew into corporations that would dominate the global market. The names of the magnates, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, no longer referred to individuals, but to institutions, foundations, and philanthropic empires whose influence stretched into the far reaches of education, science, and the arts. In a strange way, the fall of the Gilded Age gave the industrialists what they had always desired: immortality, not through their mansions, but through their impact. Yet this transformation brought another consequence, a re-evaluation of what American power meant. During the Gilded Age, power was personal. It lived in private boardrooms, in family estates, in the hands of individuals whose wealth could bend entire industries to their will. But by the 1932nd, power shifted. It became corporate, institutional, bureaucratic. No longer the domain of a single titan, it became embedded in organizations too large for any one person to control. This decentralization was both stabilizing and unsettling. It meant no single fortune could dominate the nation the way Rockefeller or Carnegie once had. But it also meant accountability became more distant, more abstract. The modern corporation replaced the mansion as the symbol of American power, sleek, efficient, impersonal. The individuals behind decisions became harder to name, harder to challenge, harder to understand. Meanwhile, the rise of the middle class reshaped the country in ways the barons of the Gilded Age could never have predicted. Families who had once lived in crowded tenements began moving into suburban homes made possible by new building techniques, mass production, and affordable mortgages. These modest houses, stretching row by row across newly paved streets, represented a different kind of dream, one built on accessibility rather than exclusivity. The wealth that had once been concentrated in the hands of a few now flowed, however imperfectly, into the pockets of millions who sought stability over opulence. Their aspirations were humble compared to the gilded fantasies of Fifth Avenue, yet they collectively built a far more durable foundation for the nation. But as America moved forward, historians noticed a fascinating pattern. The further the country moved from the Gilded Age, the more fascinated it became with it. By the mid-20th century, films, novels, and academic studies began revisiting the era with a mixture of awe and unease. The grand balls, the towering mansions, the staggering fortunes they captured, imaginations not because people wished to return to that world, but because they recognized that it represented something uniquely American. The boundless belief in possibility, even when that possibility teetered on the edge of folly. The public's interest in the Gilded Age grew not from admiration alone, but from a desire to understand how such an extreme era could have existed and how its collapse had reshaped the nation. Preservationists, once a fringe group, gained momentum. They combed through archives, documented lost estates, and saved what remnants they could. Each preserved room, each salvaged facade, each surviving mansion became a portal into a world that had nearly vanished without a trace. Visitors wandered through these spaces not to idolize the wealthy, but to witness the contradictions that defined them. Luxury built on hardship, beauty built on inequality, art collected through exploitation. This growing awareness signaled an important cultural shift. Americans were beginning to see the Gilded Age not just as history, but as a lesson about unchecked power, a lesson about the fragility of wealth, a lesson about the dangers of believing any system, no matter how magnificent, is immune to collapse. And that lesson became especially resonant as the nation faced new economic challenges. The Great Depression, which struck in 1929, revealed that even modern financial systems were vulnerable. In a moment, the optimistic glow of the 1920s, its jazz clubs, its booming markets, its air of invincibility shattered. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, unemployment soared. For a brief moment, history seemed to echo. The grand mansions still standing suddenly felt like warnings from the past, reminders of what happens when wealth consolidates too tightly, when the needs of the many clash with the fortunes of the few. The public, once enchanted by the glamour of high society, now viewed extravagance with suspicion. The nation demanded reforms once again, this time more sweeping and structural. New Deal policies reshaped government's role in the economy, building safety nets the Gilded Age had aggressively avoided. Social Security, unemployment insurance, minimum wage laws, these were not just programs, they were corrections. fixes to a system that had once rewarded excess while leaving millions vulnerable. In a sense, the final death blow to the Gilded Age came not from demolition crews, but from the changing expectations of the American people. They no longer tolerated the idea that a nation's prosperity could rest in the hands of a small elite. They demanded fairness, stability, and opportunity for everyone, and the country, at last, listened. Yet, even as the ideology of the Gilded Age faded, the fascination remained. Scholars studied its architecture, economists examined its inequalities, sociologists compared its patterns to emerging trends in modern America. The era served as both a mirror and a warning, reflecting not only who the nation once was, but who it might become again if it wasn't careful. Because beneath the ruins of Fifth Avenue, beneath the dust of demolished palaces, beneath the long shadows cast by the titans who built them, one truth lingered. History does not vanish. It repeats. And the story of America's Gilded Age, its rise, its excess, its collapse, continues to echo through every debate about wealth, power, and the direction of the nation itself. As America moved deeper into the 20th century, the remnants of the Gilded Age became quieter, subtler, harder to see. They hid in street names, in corporate logos, in museum plaques, in the steel skeletons of buildings whose origins few people remembered. The era no longer dominated the skyline, but it lingered in the country's bloodstream, a faint pulse beneath the modern world. Yet even as it faded physically, its influence resurged intellectually. Economists revisited the period to understand extreme inequality. Urban planners studied its architectural innovations and excesses. Journalists compared modern billionaires to the barons of the past, and every time the nation faced economic turbulence, the Gilded Age returned to public consciousness like a ghost stepping out of the shadows. Americans began noticing the parallels. Corporate consolidations mirrored old monopolies. Wealth began concentrating once again in the hands of a small elite. Luxury real estate reached prices reminiscent of Fifth Avenue's grandest days. Tech titans emerged with fortunes larger than some nations. As the 21st century unfolded, the echoes grew louder. And yet, despite these similarities, the past remained fundamentally different. A reminder that while patterns repeat, they never replicate exactly. The Gilded Age had been built on physical labor, industrial expansion, and resource extraction. Modern wealth grew from code, data, networks, leverage. But the cultural tension was the same. How much inequality can a society tolerate before the system fractures? Historians looking back at the old mansions saw more than architecture. They saw the anatomy of imbalance. The grand structures were not merely homes, they were monuments to a worldview, one that believed progress came from the top down, that wealth was a virtue, that success was measured by visibility. In contrast, modern American values lean toward mobility, privacy, and informality. Even billionaires avoided the spectacle of palaces. Their power lived not in ballrooms, but in boardrooms, algorithms, offshore accounts, and digital influence. Wealth still shaped society, but its expression became quieter, more diffuse, harder to scrutinize. Yet, curiously, as modern elites hid their power, interest in the flamboyance of the Gilded Age only grew. The public toured old mansions, read biographies of industrialists, watched documentaries about the era's extremes. Audiences weren't just curious about what happened, they wanted to understand why. Why had so many believed the Gilded Age was permanent? Why had they underestimated the fragility of their own world? Why had it all collapsed so quickly? To answer these questions, scholars turned to the people who rarely appeared in the Gilded narratives: the workers, immigrants, servants, clerks, factory hands, and families who lived in the shadows of the mansions. Their stories revealed the underside of the era, the overcrowded tenements, the grueling shifts, the dangers of unregulated industries, the absence of basic protections. These hidden narratives became essential to understanding the fall. The Gilded Age did not collapse because its elite ran out of money. It collapsed because the system they built was unsustainable for everyone else. The imbalance was simply too extreme. And in that realization, modern Americans saw a reflection of their own time. The constant tension between innovation and exploitation, between wealth accumulation and social responsibility. Museums began presenting the Gilded Age not as a celebration but as a study in contrasts. Astonishing beauty built on inequality, creativity fueled by competition, philanthropy paired with exploitation. Exhibits displayed not only gowns and jewels, but also photographs of sweatshops, mines, and packing plants. Visitors were invited to decide for themselves what the legacy truly was. Meanwhile, preservationists faced a race against time. The few surviving mansions required constant restoration, their stone facades weathered by decades, their interiors threatened by evolving urban environments. Every year, decisions had to be made: what to save, what to let go, what fragments of the past could realistically survive the pressures of the present. In some cases, communities chose preservation, investing money and effort to protect the rare pieces of the Gilded Age still standing. In others, practicality won out. Buildings too costly to maintain became offices, condos, or were demolished entirely. The losses echoed the original wave of destruction a century earlier, reminding observers that preservation is never guaranteed. What survived became even more precious. Visitors stepping into the Frick or the Morgan Library often described the same sensation, a feeling that time had paused, that the walls held stories the modern world had forgotten. The quiet rooms, the soft lighting, the preserved details created a sense of reverence. These spaces didn't glorify the past, they illuminated it, allowing people to understand an era that shaped the nation, while also revealing why it couldn't endure. But the most profound shift lay not in buildings or collections, but in national identity. The America that emerged from the collapse of the Gilded Age was fundamentally different from the America that had built it. The country had learned that progress demanded balance between ambition and regulation, between wealth and opportunity, between individual success and collective well-being. The reforms that followed weren't perfect, but they reflected a hard-won lesson. No society can thrive when only the very top prospers. And with each passing generation, that lesson became more relevant. As the modern era produced its own forms of inequality, Americans looked backward, not for nostalgia, but for understanding. The Gilded Age became a benchmark, a point of comparison, a warning, a case study. What happens when wealth grows too concentrated? What happens when labor is undervalued? What happens when the public loses faith in institutions? What happens when progress serves the few rather than the many? In these questions lay the true value of preserving the past, not in admiring its glamour, but in comprehending its consequences. And so, even as the mansions fell and the families vanished from public prominence, the Gilded Age endured as a lesson carved not in stone, but in memory. Its rise showed what ambition can build. Its fall showed what ambition unchecked can destroy. Its legacy continues to shape every conversation about wealth, power, and the responsibilities that accompany them. Because the real story of the Gilded Age is not about how it flourished, it's about why it ended. Even as the physical reminders of the Gilded Age vanished, the questions it raised only grew louder. The era had revealed the extraordinary heights of human ambition, fortunes built at unprecedented speed, technological revolutions that reshaped entire continents, and cultural displays that rivaled European aristocracy. But it had also revealed the deep cracks beneath that glittering surface. And those cracks became foundational for the America that emerged afterward. Throughout the 20th century, each new national challenge reflected the same tension that had defined the Gilded Age: the struggle between unfettered wealth and collective well-being. The Great Depression exposed the dangers of speculative excess. World War II demonstrated the power of unified national direction. The post-war boom showed what could happen when opportunity expanded beyond traditional elites. Yet the memory of the Gilded Age never faded completely. It resurfaced whenever inequality widened, whenever corporations grew too powerful, whenever workers demanded rights once again. The old arguments returned. Should wealth be taxed heavily? Should industries be regulated? Should government intervene in markets? Every generation repeated the same debates in new forms, each time unaware that the same battles had been fought a century before. The legacy of the era lived on most quietly in philanthropy. The great industrialists, seeking redemption or legitimacy, created foundations that far outlived their fortunes. Rockefeller funded medical research that eradicated diseases. Carnegie built thousands of libraries across the country, democratizing access to knowledge. Morgan's donations shaped museums that preserved global culture. Ironically, the public good that the wealthy had often ignored during their lives became the vehicle through which they were remembered. The institutions they funded softened the harsher edges of their histories. Visitors walking through a Carnegie library rarely considered the steel strikes. Students receiving scholarships from philanthropic trusts seldom thought about oil monopolies or broken unions. Time wrapped the past in gentler narratives, even as historians continued to peel back the layers to reveal the full complexity beneath. But the most surprising legacy of the Gilded Age was the way its fall reshaped American architecture not just physically, but philosophically. The crushing weight of maintaining 50-room palaces, the expense of enormous staffs, the tax burdens imposed on unused land, these realities forced Americans to rethink what a home was supposed to be. The ornate facades and sprawling layouts of the Gilded Age gave way to more practical designs. Smaller homes, open floor plans, functional layouts that suited modern life rather than aristocratic performance. Urban architecture followed the same trajectory. Cities began emphasizing efficient land use, public access, shared spaces. Skyscrapers became symbols not of individual wealth but of collective enterprise. Buildings served thousands, not families. Streets that once displayed private opulence now showcased public purpose. The cultural shift was unmistakable. America stopped trying to imitate European nobility and started defining its own identity, less formal, less hierarchical, less bound by inherited status. The country leaned into mobility, reinvention, accessibility, reinvestment. The collapse of the Gilded Age cleared space for democracy to grow, not perfectly, not evenly, but undeniably. Yet even as the nation embraced modernity, the ghosts of the past lingered in plain sight. In cities across the country, you can still find isolated remnants of the Gilded Age. A lone brownstone wedged between office towers, a limestone facade preserved on a block otherwise transformed, a wrought iron gate standing where a mansion once rose 4 stories tall. These fragments act like archaeological traces, hints of a civilization erased before it could become ancient. Some passers-by barely notice them. Others stop, stare, and imagine the world that once existed behind those stones. The echo of carriage wheels, the glow of chandeliers, the murmur of servants moving silently through back corridors, the quiet arrogance of families certain their legacy would last forever. If they could see the modern world, they might not recognize it. The social hierarchies they protected dissolved. The rituals they perfected vanished. The institutions they dominated democratized. The fortunes they built fragmented. The homes they designed to stand for centuries were erased in decades. Even the titles they sought through marriage, Duke, Countess, Viscountess, lost their cultural power in America's evolving society. But perhaps the greatest irony is that the Gilded Age remained unforgettable precisely because it ended. Had the mansions survived, had the wealth persisted unchanged, had the old families held on to their influence, the era might blend into the ordinary flow of history. Instead, its rapid rise and dramatic fall created a contrast too stark to ignore. It became a lesson, a warning, a story retold not because of nostalgia, but because of meaning. And at the core of that meaning lies a truth that shaped the nation's evolution. Any system built on extreme imbalance will eventually crumble not through disaster, but through inevitability. When wealth accumulates faster than society can absorb it, when privilege grows more important than responsibility, when opulence becomes the measure of worth, collapse is only a matter of time. The Gilded Age believed itself immortal, but the nation around it was changing faster than its elites ever realized. As the 20th century progressed, Americans embraced entertainment, technology, culture, and ideas that would have baffled their Gilded Age ancestors. Jazz replaced waltzes. Cinemas replaced opera boxes. Automobiles replaced carriages. Radios replaced drawing room conversations. Public schools expanded, universities grew, civic engagement increased. And with each innovation, the distance between past and present widened. By the time historians labeled the era gilded, its end was already long past. The word itself, borrowed from Mark Twain, captured the contradiction perfectly. Gold on the outside, something far more complicated beneath. The modern world could admire the shine without forgetting the cost. And that, perhaps, is the enduring power of the Gilded Age's story, not the glamour, not the architecture, not the fortunes, but the reminder that even the brightest eras cast shadows. Understanding both is the only way to understand the nation itself.